I want to welcome you to this episode of the Saturate webinar. This is the last in our series called Church of the Future, and essentially what we've done, several of you are joining us for the first time, so what we've done this fall is recognize, okay, we've at least figured out, at any given moment what we need to be doing as it relates to COVID in our churches. And so what we've tried to do is get ahead of the ball a little bit and go, okay, so at some point, God willing, we'll come out of this season. Now, again, we started this in September and things look different today across our country and continent and world than they did in September. So we recognize that, but we're trusting God that at some point COVID will go away. And also that there are things that we've all learned during this season that we can take into the future. And so we've considered what'll change as far as leadership development goes, and what'll change as far as local church practices go, and this kind of stuff. We started with Daniel Yang, who, along with Jeff Christopherson and some others in the Send Institute, have done a lot of looking and projecting the North American church in 2050. And so what we're trying to do is answer questions, not just immediately coming out of COVID this fall, whenever that happens, but bringing things that we can learn from COVID, or that perhaps COVID shined a light on more overtly, that have been brewing under the surface in many of our churches and in Christian culture across North America for many years and perhaps decades. And so today, we're wrapping up that series of webinars by talking about missional communities of the future. We trust that there are things that God has brought to the surface during this COVID season that are either new things that we can pay attention to as we move forward, or perhaps, again, they're old things that are just bubbling up more overtly than they have. And so some of you coming in are new to the missional community concept, or the missional community church model, or ministry philosophy, or whatever term we want to put on it. And so some of you might be coming in going, oh, this could be something that I want to start and lean into going into the future. And so I hope that our conversation today will serve you from some experienced practitioners of missional communities. And others are in the same boat that the four of us who are going to have today's conversation are in that we've been leading out in missional communities for varying amounts of years, and trying to equip and sustain and love leaders well, and multiply out communities in various contexts across the U.S. And all of our good work kind of went up in the air, 9 months ago now, or whatever it was. And so we've been learning alongside many of you who have been practicing missional community life, just to try to navigate what changes are needed. And so we're just going to share and have a conversation today about some of those changes, and the goods and the hards about them, and things we hope go back to normal whenever this whole season passes, and things that we hope, hey, there's actually goodness in them, and things that we hope can carry on beyond this COVID season. So I'll introduce our panel for today, and then I'll pray for us, and then I will give them the floor. So Allison Martin is Deacon of Missional Communities and part of the lead team of Doxa Church in Bellevue. She's on staff there and has led out well in this transition. We've gotten to have a lot of conversations over the summer and beyond about everyday discipleship and decentralizing, and I know that Doxa has pivoted in more of a high-tech, high-profile urban context outside of Seattle as far as missional communities. Jared Pickney is not in a high-tech, high urban context outside of Seattle. He is pastor of vision and teaching of the Crossing Church in Paragould, Arkansas. And they also have navigated this well. They've been leading out in missional communities for a long time in a more southern context. And a place for missional communities is maybe a little bit less expected of specific church models. And so they've let out well pre-COVID, and they've let out well during COVID as well. And then James Duff is elder of preaching and missional communities at the Hill Communities, which is based in Hawley, New Jersey, which is right outside of Philly. So a good Northeast perspective that Duff is going to bring in, as he also has let out both some newer church contexts as they planted just a couple of years ago, and also just a good right outside of Philly kind of context he's bringing to us. So, and I'm Ben Conley. I planted City Church in Fort Worth, Texas in 2009. We've been trying to shape around missional communities for the last 11 years. Myself and another co-elder are being planted out of City Church to pursue even more of a decentralized simple church model in Fort Worth as well. So we've been asking a lot of these questions, even personally, and learning a lot during this COVID season. So that's a lot of introductions. I'm going to pray for us and introduce God the Spirit into the conversation, who is our primary teacher. So, Father, I do thank you. I give you all thanks and praise that your mission and the concept of Christian community has won the day in easy seasons, quote unquote, and in hard seasons in this continent and in others. God, I thank you for the history of flexibility and the history of innovation that you've put in your people that we get to learn from. I thank you in this moment that we have your Spirit to guide us and lead us, and that you give us everything needed for life and godliness, and that we have your wisdom and your ability to rely on, especially in moments like this where we feel overtly at the end of ourselves, and when we feel overtly as leaders like we have nothing to lead in and we have no wisdom. So I thank you for the ways that you've shaped each of these friends over the past several months. I thank you for the ways that these churches and several others have pursued mission and community and been able to make changes. I thank you for everyone who's on here today and everyone that'll be impacted by this. God, would you just give us your wisdom and help us learn from you and hear from you, and would you continue to shape us all? We were talking before we started, none of us are experts. None of us have the silver bullet to bring to the table, but you do, God. You know the future, and you are our expert, and you are our strength and our weakness in this kind of thing. So guide our conversation today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I'm just going to throw it to Duff and Allison and Jared, maybe in that order, just so y'all are all polite, and we'll wait for everybody else to go first. So we'll go Duff, Allison, then Jared. As far as a little more of who you are and your perspective on this, what have you learned about missional communities in this season that might continue into the future? I prompted them for everybody else to know, like maybe perhaps things you didn't expect, whether good or bad, or things that were able to stay the same, or things that changed. And so I just want to let them open up the conversation by sharing what they're learning.
Yeah, I think a few things we've learned. One, I think the biggest thing was probably it exposed how delicate our large gatherings were and how essential MCs are. And so I think a lot of things came out of that. Teaching and learning that a lot of the things that we do in our gatherings, we can do in our MCs, things like communion and singing songs and teaching and all of those things. Imagine that you can do that in your house with other people, and you don't need a full-time staff to run that. And so that was really cool to see a lot of our groups kind of embrace that. Also really helped us understand that we do desire to be together. I think sometimes our Sunday gatherings are, we go out of tradition, we go out of obligation, but when you don't have that, all of a sudden there was a deeper desire to actually get together and to be together and to know each other deeper. So I think that was really interesting for our people to see. It really helped them deepen relationships with one another, with Jesus as well. I think it also helped us process where our heart really lies with the church, and not just in like the larger gathering, but in community, in our communities, with each other, and really kind of expose really what the gospel is really about. So I think that was really helpful for us. We broke down a lot of walls of just kind of a singular focus on gathering, and opened up more opportunities for our MCs to live out the gospel. And so I think it also, some of the bad, it showed a lot of deficiencies that we had in our MCs, in our gatherings, in our leadership, in our shepherding. So it exposed a lot of stuff that we had to do our own kind of care for, soul care even, as shepherds. And so, and then I think the last thing, it really helped people take ownership of some things. Where in a gathering, you can come and show up. With an MC, you have to participate at some level. And so it really helped them take ownership of some things. So those are a few things that we were kind of learning here in Mount Holly. And we're in a context that is very heavy Catholic. Not a lot of people are going to church. And so the missional communities people have started to kind of latch onto has been really beautiful to see. So yeah, those are a few things for me.
Great, thanks, Steph. Allison, other side of the country?
Yes, over here in Bellevue. So yeah, I'll just give you some of our COVID context, if that's helpful. Our last in-person church gathering was back in March, which is so hard to believe. And we're just now starting to dip our toe into in-person gatherings. We're just trying to, it's like the year of creativity, getting creative with all the ways we do all the things. And then our day-to-day restrictions under state guidelines has been restricted to 5 people outside of your household per week. So this really has impacted our MC's ability to meet together. So like some of the challenges we've faced and questions we've had to ask ourselves are like, okay, so how, like our MCs, pretty much none of our MCs are able to legally meet in person, but our DNAs are. So we just decided to do the pivot from, instead of being so MC heavy, to just encourage all of our folks to double down on DNA. And then we've also just been wrestling with like, how much guidance do we give our MCs and MC leaders of like staying in touch? And then how much do we like kind of lay off and not be, you know, like nagging mom and dad coming after them with like all these, what we think are great ideas. Just like not wanting to micromanage, but also wanting to equip them and give them ideas that are actually helpful. And then also just grappling with like how, when we can't meet in person, do we keep our groups on mission and encourage them in that? So, and like to answer that question, what we've decided to do is really focus and provide more structure for DNA. One thing that we did is like a Zoom DNA mixer, where if you're not in a DNA, but you want to come to this like Zoom thing and like you'll meet people and then you get paired up within, with people from your area and meet as a DNA. And then in terms of leadership development, we've had mentors walk with those brand new DNA groups through the first 4 to 6 weeks. And then we've also had to kind of simplify our connection process. We had this great thing called the Discipleship Pathway, and it was like 9 different sessions that you go to. We called it like Doxa 101, which is just 1 class, 201, which is 3, and 301, which is 4. And it was so effective in establishing strong new MCs, but you can't really do that. So we had to kind of pivot away from that and get creative with that. And so we kind of saw this DNA mixer is taking the place of that. And now looking ahead to January, we're looking at, okay, it's great we're establishing these DNA groups, but now we want to be more intentional in getting those folks into missional communities. And then another learning that we've gotten out of this is just how essential coaching is. So there's really no cookie cutter way of equipping MCs to do their thing. Everyone is in like different places in all of this. And so it really has been so beneficial to have this individualized approach where our coaches are talking one-on-one to each MC leader saying like, hey, what are you struggling with? What do you need help with? And then they come back to Adam and I. Adam is also on the MC team. And so like we know, okay, here's what they need specifically so we can actually be helpful and like give them things that they actually need. An example of that is like normally we're with mission, we're like, hey, we don't want to like micromanage your mission. You guys live in your communities, you know what the needs are, go, you know, find your mission. We've had to sort of switch gears in that, and we've actually provided specific missional opportunities for people to like sign up for and to serve together as an MC. And that has just been, I think that's my biggest excitement in all of this. Our people have responded so well and so strongly to that. So those are just some of our like the broad brush strokes. I'm happy to get into it more specifically later on. But yeah, those are some of our main learnings.
Yeah, that's great. That's helpful. Jared. Jared, I think you're muted.
There we are. All
There
right.
we go.
Arkansas for the win with technology. I just want to start by saying I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I'm glad that there are others that see the importance of this. Whenever the pandemic hit back in March, our staff read a book together called Canoeing the Mountains. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that. But it's basically just this idea. It's about Lewis and Clark and their adventure with this core discovery and how they set out, to try to find the Pacific Ocean. And whenever they thought they were going to hit the ocean, eventually they hit the Rocky Mountains. They'd never seen them before in their entire life. And the author of this book, he talks about how, whenever we come into uncharted territory, we can either try to canoe the mountains or we can get out of the boat and we can realize like there's maybe a new means or there's a new method of how we're going to still accomplish the same goal. And so I do think that adaptive leadership is going to kind of win the day as we move forward. So this is a really important conversation to think about the future of MCs and how do we restructure and all of that in light of what's happened. And so that being said, I would just say to add to what Allison and James said, a lot of what they've said we've experienced here, but we planted this church, the Crossing, in I guess it was 8 years ago. And we started from day one, primarily being structured around missional communities. We had, I think it was 6 adults in our first missional community. And then within 8 years before the pandemic hit, we had around 450 people that were involved in missional communities. And that was great for doing the Saturate podcast and conferences and talking about missional communities. But when the pandemic hit, we really thought that our church was going to be perfectly positioned for this shutdown. So we were actually kind of excited, like, all right, like now's the time for us to prove to everybody just how important it is to be structured around missional communities. But what we found out the hard way is just because our missional communities had been growing over the last 8 years, it didn't mean the people within those MCs had been growing. I don't know if that makes any sense. And in fact, whenever we begin to look at other churches in our city, some of which were still doing ministry like it was the 1950s, our people didn't look a whole lot different than them. And so the marriages didn't look different, how they were handling stress and anxiety, their parenting, none of that stuff looked a lot different. And so after a lot of thought and prayer, out of a deep desire that we have here to make resilient disciples of Jesus, we did a complete relaunch actually of our missional communities. So that's the first time we've ever done that. We officially relaunched all of our MCs at the beginning of this month. And we can talk a lot more about, what that looks like and the details of that. But I guess probably the big takeaway for me is just because you have the structure, just because you have missional communities, doesn't mean it's like a plug and play deal where you put it in place all of a sudden, like you're going to be producing these amazing, like, tough, solid, Christ-like, spiritually mature people. And so we've kind of had to go back to the drawing board, and we still have MCs. We've restructured them, and we can talk more about it, Ben, or whoever wants to, as much as you want to, in a lot of that. So,
yeah, appreciate the honesty in that. And I'll echo that a little bit. One of the things that we saw in Fort Worth was, on one hand, and this is in addition to kind of what was already said, because there's some unity among the four of us of seeing some things even in our different contexts. But just to add to what's already been said, on one hand, we saw more people kind of coming out of the woodwork going, hey, I can step up and own a few people who otherwise wouldn't have. And so, just to some of what's already been said, like, we were really grateful for that opportunity. Now I think they thought it'd be like, oh yeah, we can lead a small community for like 2 months. And now we're like, well, apparently we've got you hooked indefinitely. So we're having to navigate that now, kind of longer term training and coaching. To Allison's point, coaching is so essential in this moment, both of new leaders and current ones. So on one hand, we saw people coming out of the woodwork and saying, yes, I can step up and own some of this. So we saw people kind of growing in their trust of the Spirit within them and stepping into some leadership roles. And at the same time, we saw how much we had assumed the gospel and gospeling one another was happening in the context of those communities. And we really, in the same way, Jared kind of had to go back to the basics of going, hey, just because we had this structure and have talked, perhaps more in general and less specifically over time, as we've kind of just swam in this water for a long time, we've realized that a lot of the conversations happening in our communities reflected a lot of the conversations of the world around us, and both in COVID specific and then everything else that's gone on within this year. Folks are having a hard time connecting. And long-term DNA folks, long-term missional community folks are having a hard time applying the gospel in very tangible, specific ways. So we've had to do some going back to the basics as well, in the midst of some other transitions that our church is going through. One more data point, and then we can just open up a little bit of a conversation. So this is a question that someone asked, and I think that the answers are going to be different for all of us. So just a 2-second snapshot. Are your MCs meeting in person? If so, how many people? Are masks? Kind of what are some other precautions? And again, I know we're all in different contexts, but even those different contexts could help the rest of our conversation, I think. Jerry, do first this time. We'll go backwards.
Yeah. So when the pandemic first hit, we went to Zoom, and then like things, which is really interesting, by the way, like Arkansas, like the county that I'm in didn't even have like its first case for like the first like 7 or 8 weeks in the pandemic, but we were completely shut down. And we were on Zoom, and then people got tired of that, and there wasn't really a lot of, movement around here. The cases weren't climbing. So we went back to gathering, probably I think after a couple months, and our MCs began to meet pretty much like in backyards, at the park, just stayed outdoors, some were in homes. And then that's still happening, but now that it's getting cooler, we're back to meeting. Some are in homes, some are on Zoom. But to hit on what Allison said, what has continued through this entire thing has been DNAs have continued to meet regularly, because those are smaller groups. And I saw in the chat someone was even asking what a DNA is, and so I'm sure we'll get into that more. Yeah, and so that's been the one constant through all of the ups and downs of this. So.
For us, a new executive order just came out on Sunday. So our MCs will not be meeting in person anymore. Some of them have been, and they've been having, because of the 5-person restriction, they've had to get kind of creative with like some Zoom in, some meet in person, or like they rotate. But now with this new restriction, our MCs will not be meeting in person. However, our DNAs are able to meet outside, but I don't know if you've seen the weather in Seattle. It is atrocious. So, we're trying to come up with like fun ideas, like giving them like a DNA kit, which is like, we have a bunch of pop-up tents here at the building. And so like, if you want to borrow a tent, do that. And we'll also give you some little hand warmers. Yeah, so lots of creativity.
Yeah, we shut down in March, and we were pretty shut down. We were allowed to meet with our MC, so a lot of them met outside. We actually just got some new orders yesterday too. I haven't worked my way through all those, but I know that's decreased, so we'll probably have to pivot on some things in the coming weeks. But our MCs have been meeting through all this pretty much as they were. Again, mostly outside though. Same thing though, now it's getting a little colder here in the Northeast. So, trying to figure out, some of those groups are meeting inside. Some of them, some of them wear masks, some of them don't. Some have a mix of both. It's really their comfortability with that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. We've encouraged our folks to kind of love each other as family, and if somebody has a concern or somebody has a risk, especially or that kind of stuff, just kind of default as an entire group to whatever they feel most comfortable with. So, I'm in Texas. We crushed coronavirus according to all of our state officials and stuff back in June. So it doesn't exist here, except that it very much does. But even with that, even with a lot of open restrictions, almost no restrictions as far as this size group gathering goes, we've still seen across the board folks do different things. Yeah, Michaela, your question is fair, and forgive the insider acronyms and this kind of stuff. So we should clarify what we say, what we're talking about. So MCs, missional communities, I will broadly define, although all of us could nuance it, as a smallish group of disciples of Jesus who try to live as family on mission together to make disciples who make disciples. what that looks like is going to vary per context, and sometimes mission's more integrated, sometimes it's more supportive, various size groups, various ways that mission is pursued, but that's kind of what a missional community is. DNA group is a smaller subset of that, generally same gender, generally 2 to 4-ish folks, who are committed to dive deeper into each other's lives. DNA stands for discover, nurture, act. So you're discovering God's truth together, nurturing each other's hearts, and then pursuing some sort of action, both missionally and just in obedience to God. So I'll leave that there, and we can move forward. So DNAs are smaller pockets, often within missional communities, but not always. And that leads to a question, just hearing a lot of the conversation where we've been, some things we've seen. It seems like there's been, on one hand, a focus on smaller. And that makes all the sense in the world with restrictions and this kind of stuff. With that focus on smaller, I'm curious to know if you've seen, like, can a lot of the things that used to happen in DNA, in missional communities, kind of that mid-sized, if I can use that term, can a lot of the things that happen in missional communities happen in those smaller, either DNA proper groups or kind of DNA sized missional communities? Have y'all seen those things? Whoever can go first this time.
Yeah, I can pipe in. We have, before when we were sort of sending all of these missional, serving opportunities to MCs, why not have a DNA do that? We have some specific opportunities that are just perfect for DNAs to serve in together. So we have been seeing that, and DNAs participate in that. And then I can't remember if it was Jared or James talking about, it may have been you, Jared, talking about the concern of not seeing the spiritual formation of people within your MCs. So our DNA team, they've written these wonderful spiritual formation guides, and we go through a different spiritual practice every quarter. We've done Sabbath, silence and solitude, Bible reading, prayer. And those guides are written for both MCs, and there's one, a discussion guide for an MC context. And then there's also, to go along with that, a discussion guide for DNA. So you're just kind of taking what you're doing in MC and just homing in on a little bit more and getting even deeper to the soul level within DNA. So they complement each other really well. And since a lot of our MCs aren't, meetings just look a little bit different, we're seeing a lot of that work that would happen in the MC context happen in DNA in terms of spiritual formation.
Specific to Allison and other, you two guys can chime in as well. What about the missional side of that? Are DNAs walking into mission together on some level?
That was just for Allison, or you said we can all tune in?
Sorry, I was going to follow up with Allison and ask her.
Yeah.
She talked about the spiritual formation side. So is the mission side happening as well, Allison? And then you. No, I didn't make that clear. Sorry.
Is the missional side happening within DNA? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are seeing that. Some examples are, there's this organization that serves underprivileged families, and they need 600 bags of groceries every week. And we've needed people to help out with that and do the shopping and delivery. And so some of our DNAs have done that together. We're also doing an Advent drive where you get to adopt a family through the Boys and Girls Club, which is really exciting because that's not a Christian organization. And so we're getting to partner with them. And some DNAs have signed up together to do that. And so they adopt this family, they get a wish list and get to do the shopping together, and then serve these underprivileged families in that way. So yeah, we're seeing mission happen in DNA, which is new for us. That never even occurred to us pre-COVID. It was all about the missional communities. So that's been exciting to see.
Cool. Great. Sorry for my confusion on that. Duff and Jared, why don't you chime in as far as what you're seeing on that as well?
Well, I would say just being fully transparent, whenever when we relaunched our missional communities, some of our MCs had 40 to 45 people in them before we relaunched. And now when we relaunch, we start with groups of 6 to 8 adults, and then we encourage all MCs to multiply by 12. And so pretty much our MCs have one DNA group, or one for women and one for men. And so our DNAs are now anywhere between 4 to 5, somewhere around there, 5 to 6. And what I would just say, as far as the mission goes, one thing I want to be clear on is because, and I even saw this in the chat, some people will begin to talk about, when we go smaller like that, we begin to focus on DNAs, or we're going to be moving away from everyone being on mission together. And at least this was just my experience. Over the last 8 years, we never had a full consensus in our missional communities of everybody was on mission together. We always had specific mission focuses for each group, but it was just never reality that when you had a group of 35 adults, or maybe 30 adults, or even 25 adults, getting all 25 of those adults together on one mission never was reality. It was almost always for us 5 to 6, 7, 8 adults tops that were really carrying the brunt of the mission, and then everybody else kind of come and go, check in, check out, that sort of thing. And so I would just say DNAs, I think in many ways, as to speak with what Allison is saying, it provides for us a context to be even more missional because of that accountability piece, or that ACT piece, as you were calling it with the DNAs, to where when you have a smaller group like that, everyone knows everyone. It's much more difficult to fall through the cracks. And so what I see DNAs as in this season is an opportunity to come together and to really kind of, pop the hood on all of life, including the mission piece, and ensure how are we actually living out mission? And one of the things that we've realized is the most missional thing we can do, and this is not like just a pastor cop-out answer, but the most missional thing we can do is pray for the lost. I truly believe that more than ever in my life. And so we're actually, with our DNAs, one of the things we're encouraging them to do is once a month to spend the entire DNA meeting praying for their lost friends, or praying for that lost whatever people group that they're focusing on. So I would say we're seeing so far as well that focus on the smaller group and in the DNA, there is a missional component to it that I think is going to be healthier than even with the larger group focus only.
Great.
For us, we I guess in all honesty, we haven't put a huge focus on DNA groups. We're all bivocational as pastors, and so our limit is something that we have learned has gone like this. And so we've been focused on our MCs. And actually what we found was that a lot of our MCs needed gospel work inside their own MC. There was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of loss of jobs. And so we had to really kind of get our MCs to focus inward actually for a little while. And I think sometimes when you talk about missional communities and DNAs, it's all outward, and I think sometimes there are seasons, and I think right now is one of them, where some MCs, maybe not all, but some need that inward focus. And so what we've seen out of that is that some DNAs have just formed naturally, actually. And they are actually doing some things on their own. We had a couple guys actually start a youth group out of an MC. And so that was pretty neat, just because they had this desire to do that. And so that was pretty awesome that we have a very small youth group now, which is an MC of kids. So it's been great to kind of see that. But so that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, it seems like, as I'm hearing you, I mean, we've experienced the same. It seems like there's a little bit of a blurring of kind of what was a little bit more black and white, perhaps in some of our churches. DNA was this, missional community was this. And it seems like there's a little bit of a gray that as I hear, and I don't want to project, but I'm hearing you say like, hey, there's actually some fruit coming out of that. So is there some of that you're seeing that's good that you'd hope to carry forward into the future? And at the same time, is there anything we're missing that there's a caution raising up? Is there any caution raising up in you about that blurring of lines?
I think there's for us, it's we're trying not to force things right now. I think there is a tendency to say, well, here's our model, we have to do it, rather than look at it and say, hey, our MCs are actually, some of them are healthy, some of them are not, some of them need to multiply, some of them need some care. And so looking at those things individually, but I do think there is a lot of fruit coming out of both like exposing where people's hearts are and being able to kind of dive into that, but then also people that are in a healthier place, even forming their own DNA groups and mission outwards, even on their own, without any of our help, to be honest with you, other than our support. And so I think there's fruit naturally happening, and sometimes we need to just allow that to happen rather than try to like orchestrate it.
Yeah, that's good. Like trust the Spirit, Duff, rather than our own methods. Is that what you're suggesting?
Something along those lines, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good. Somebody else.
I want to just speak to what James said, 'cause I think the Spirit of God is doing something, because I've been talking to other pastors that have been basically saying what he says in different parts of the country. And I think that when you begin to hear that, like, pay attention, because God is, he's doing a work. And so the word God gave us back in I don't know, I guess it's probably April, is part of the reason that we were not making resilient disciples who made it the resilient disciples. Is kind of the word that I believe God spoke to us, is that we have been helicopter pastors rather than equipping pastors. And so kind of the image we had is my daughter during the pandemic learned how to, or one of my kids, it's my daughter, learned how to ride her bike. And there was this time where I had to let go and trust, like, she could do it, that she could keep moving. And that was very difficult for me because I wanted to be there, right? And I felt like that was my job, to like protect her and all that. And I feel like that as a pastor, our intentions have been good a lot of times of, kind of like what James is saying, like, we're going to build all these forms and we're going to like give you like, here's the answer to this. And if that don't work, here's the answer for that. And then here's where you turn right here. And here's what you do right here, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, we're starting to realize that if our people are going to grow up, we have to put ministry back into their hands. Right. And so like, another thing that kind of, that just keeps popping up in my mind is this idea that, like, graveyards are neat and tidy and gardens are messy. And if we're really going to experience growth, we're going to have to be okay with some of the mess, if that makes sense. So I think there is going to be, to speak to your point, Ben, some blurred lines and some things where it's like, wait a minute, like, how do we title that? Or where does this fit in there? And maybe it won't so much fit, and that's okay, because it's a sign the Spirit is just up to something and it's going to get outside of our box, and we just got to be okay with that.
Yeah. That's good. Jared, Allison, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it has been interesting to see like these blurred lines, but I mean, I just, with DNAs being on mission, I'm like, oh yeah, why didn't we think of that before? And I totally welcome that. And I hope that continues. When you asked about like the caution we have, something I've just been like, I don't know, feeling caution about is that I still do feel that like both DNA and MC are together essential for discipleship. So one of the things I have caution about is like, after all of this, will people still feel that need for MC? Because even though, in the past, like for Dox's history, the first few years was actually all about MC and not really DNA. And now we've kind of swung to the other side because we've had to, where it's all about, it's largely about DNA. And so after COVID, I just hope we can kind of get to the middle and still have both. Adam has such a great analogy. He calls it like two pedals on a bicycle, MC and DNA. It's just like essential to just like, to growing disciples, to be like well-rounded and to serve outwards, but then also to like, become spiritually formed and to be known and vulnerable, like within the DNA context.
Yeah, that's good. I think one thing that I've felt as well, and this is even 10 minutes before we started, I was like, what do I think the future of MCs are, missional communities are coming out of this? And just an immediate thought that came to mind, there'll be more than this, but the immediate thought that came to mind is that they need to be more deprofessionalized, kind of less of an organizational focus, and they need to be more dependent. And so I'm really glad that we've gotten to this place, that God, there's some unity in all four of our contexts of going, hey, the former forms aren't there anymore, which allows us and mandates that we step out of the way and do what we all say and preach and equip our folks for, and actually do it. Let God be God. and then focus a little bit less on the organization and the specific forms themselves, deprofessionalize it, let him birth whatever he's going to birth, which to Jared's point is a little messier, sometimes a lot messier, but it's actually putting ministry in the hands of the priesthood of believers, and that's a really beautiful thing. So deprofessionalized and dependent is something that I hope we don't lose coming out of this, whenever out of this happens. So folks are asking good questions. If you have questions, put them in there. The number we have right now could probably take us to the end of our time. So I'm going to dive into them kind of in the categories of the two sides of that title, missional community. And we've already recognized there's some seasons. And if you're new to our content, Saturate and Soma have for a long time said, hey, there's different seasons, kind of breathing in seasons, breathing out seasons. You're not going to be able to focus 50-50 on mission and community or formation and serving or that kind of stuff always, every time you're together, every season of life and this kind of stuff. And so I think what I've seen, and I think I've heard from some of you, is that some of you and some of your folks are yearning more for how do we do mission well in this? And perhaps the community side is going better. Others are thinking like, hey, we're crushing it on mission. We're seeing open doors, but our community side is harder during this. And if that's where you're coming in, I'm going like, oh, we're missing half of it. Hey, I just want to encourage you participants, like, whatever God has for you in this season is what he's designed for you. And if this is a season of more kind of rallying the troops, then that can be okay. And if it's a season where God has you out forming new relationships, that can be okay as well. Be different if it's a year from now and the other side hasn't been touched, but just to try to help us breathe a little bit easier. All of us are trying to navigate this. None of the four of us and nobody participating are experts in what this is supposed to look like. We all feel like we're about 2 yards down the field with 98 to go in how this is. So with that said, though, folks, let's focus on the mission side. Have you found new approaches? This is from Jessica. Have you found new approaches to help people meet people of peace, persons of peace, during this season of COVID?
We've just continued to tell our people what we've been telling them. Use what you have for the gospel. So your time, your treasure, your talent. And so like hospitality, being outside, meeting your neighbors, walking in your town, like none of that should be new. That should just be a continuation of what you've been doing. And so might look a little different, but I think we've just been trying to encourage our people. There's still things that you can do that were the same. And so don't try to like make up some brilliant big idea plan when all you need to do is walk across the street. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, we still kind of lovingly beat that drum. I don't think we have a single meeting with our leaders where we're not saying, hey, and like remember, like look around you, who lives next door, and we encourage them to just stay within their community. Even when we're all like holed up in our houses. And then we like created a resource. We love our resources at Doxa, of what like we have a resource website that has like specific missional ideas and opportunities you can kind of pursue. And then when we hear about leaders doing that, we make sure to share that story, and because it can just be such an encouragement to others, and things that like people would like. One example was there is this one gal, she's one of our MC leaders. Her neighbor is a single mom and needed lunches for her kids, and the public schools are giving out free lunches for people to pick up. And so this MC leader was like, oh, well, I can pick them up for you, because she wasn't able to, she was working. So our MC leader every single day throughout the summer would get the lunches for her neighbor's children. And I mean, how simple and yet so like beautiful and practical, and a picture of like who Jesus is that. So we just made sure to share that with all of our MC leaders. And I think that's just helpful to encourage people to look around for just the simple opportunities that are right in front of you. It's so right in front of you, you just don't even notice.
I don't know if I'd add anything new to that, but it does seem that when you read in the scriptures that a lot of Jesus's ministry, a lot of the mission was as he was going. So he wasn't even like going to necessarily go do the mission. Like it was like he was maybe going somewhere else. Like, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, here's a woman with a bleeding issue or whatever, you know, and or here's a teaching opportunity. And so I do think that's very important that we, that we help people to see that, like, yeah, like you have the same spirit that Christ had, and let's learn how to be in two places at once, to be, you know, walking into the restaurant or into the grocery store or at work and aware of the presence of God and how the Holy Spirit is prompting us. And so whenever the shutdown happened, we said we're going to focus on 4 areas. Kind of first, we're going to focus on equipping people to lead themselves. Then we're going to focus on the home. Like we really have this kind of view now of like the home as a monastery, of like, man, like this is really a place for deep spiritual formation. And if you have kids, like that's your greatest disciples, like that is your greatest mission. And so like, let's not neglect them and what God's doing there. And then the workplace is huge, because one thing that didn't shut down here in Arkansas was everybody still worked. Like that never stopped. And I know that maybe it's different in other places. And so we just begin to say, man, like what if instead of trying to equip people for our world with our structures, like let's equip them to live as missionaries in their workplaces. And we've seen great fruit from that. And then like Doxa, we've just recently kind of done the same thing you guys have done, I think, where you identify needs in the city. And then we have a guy on our staff, we're able to do that, who kind of serves as an in-between, where he builds these bridges with a person of peace, whether it's in the Muslim community or CASA or our homeless shelter. He develops great relationships with them, takes them out to eat, and then basically kind of connects them to other MC leaders, and to where that way they can also begin to develop that relationship and help meet some of those needs.
And the only other thing I'd add to those really good comments is just paying attention to the conversations we're having and who responds. Whereas, you know, I think a lot of person of peace language, at least in the vein that I've learned it in, is kind of who invites you into relationship, who invites you into homes, which means there would be no people of peace anymore because nobody's going to invite you into their home and this kind of thing. But to think about it another way is, you know, kind of the image that comes to mind is kind of dripping spiritual things into the conversations, that even on walks or in the normal context of folks that we are, you know, seeing from across the street, walking his dog every day, this kind of stuff. Are we able to kind of, again, drip is probably an oversimplified or too frivolous of a word, but kind of drip spiritual things, drip gospel moments into the conversations, and just paying attention to who responds that way on a more one-on-one basis, and whether that leads to another network or just a one-on-one relationship that continues, that can be helpful. So sticking on the same theme of mission, Allison, specifically for you, question came in, what are a couple of others of the missions suggestions that Doxa provided for MCs to sign up? So I'll just let Allison answer this one, then we'll move on to another question.
Yeah, so the grocery drive and their Adopt the Family were 2 examples. And then a couple others when quarantine happened, where it was like a stay-at-home order. We have a pretty good relationship with our Department of Children, Youth, and Families office. They take care of like all foster care and CPS and everything. So I reached out to them and I was like, hey, like, do you guys need anything? I would imagine this is a really difficult time because normally the mandatory reporters are teachers, but none of the kids are in school. So she was like, yes, if your church could rally to provide like boredom buster items, so entertainment activities for kids, not even in foster care, but in like high risk home life situations, that would be amazing. And within like a couple weeks, our people provided over like $2,500 worth of like activities, workbooks, educational things, tablets. It was amazing. So that was one quarantine-friendly missional opportunity. You know, normally we like to do like the more relational thing, which this isn't as much because it's just like unnamed people providing items, but it has just added to our years of building relationship with this government office that has a reputation for being very anti-church. And then another one is that we're just launching is called Care Communities. And that is where like a missional community or DNA is matched with a foster family that's like a 15-minute drive from them, not necessarily like a Doxa Christian family at all, I'm actually hoping for a lot of non-believing families. And the MC wraps around that foster family in practical and ways of, so they'll provide a weekly meal, they'll provide childcare, they'll provide practical items like diapers, clothes, whatever. They can do child mentoring, tutoring, and they've also pivoted to be COVID friendly to do all of this in a digital format. So, like the meal might just be, a door drop off. Child mentoring and tutoring can be over Zoom. So those are some of our other specific opportunities. Care communities in particular, I'm excited about because it is so relationship heavy. And you have a team leader who is like the main liaison between the foster family and the care community. And like they're asking every week, like, how can we be praying for you? And yeah, I'm super excited about that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And again, those are examples, but the possibilities, I'm sure, endless, and every context has different ones. I think Sunny just shared in the chat some of the creative ideas that Doxa has shared as well. So Jared, question for you, since you talked about the home being a monastery, and again, you go forever on this, so be brief, but a lot of MCs involve family worship, kids, especially, especially as folks are keeping their kids, especially younger kids, around them more right now. And so what are some ways that you guys have found in that family as monastery, home as monastery mindset to equip for family worship and MCs investing in kids?
Yeah, well, I'll just say in short, what we're going to do is we're in the process right now of building out an actual class that people will take and a whole workbook that will help them establish kind of their own healthy rhythms. But I would just say, teaching people first off for mom and dad to do silence and solitude, to spend time with Jesus in the morning. Those are things that most people are not doing before they rush out. Having a meal together at least 5 times a week, aim at that, maybe not every night a week, but try to get around a table somewhere, whether at a restaurant or at home, praying over their children. We have an app that we give our parents to help them with scripture reading with family, things like that. And so it's nothing that any of us, I think, would look at and say like, wow, I've never thought about that before. But we're just realizing that most of our people were not establishing those rhythms in their home. So, but we are building out a whole course that we're hoping we'll launch by March that will help our folks do all of those things. So.
Yeah. And a lot of what we've seen is helping equip parents, just giving them some questions to ask or giving some ideas. And again, like we're saying, with kind of folks stepping up and saying, yes, I can lead a DNA or a missional community for a little bit. We've seen a lot of parents say, oh, this, to Jared's point, this seems obvious. I just didn't have anyone kind of pointing me back to something I knew to be true of, here's a question with an answer, with a potential couple of answers attached to it, and just helping truly equip parents and helping them see that the Spirit of God lives in them. And that they're already doing a lot of it has been freeing for some of our parents as well. So Duff, I'm going to give you a one-on-one as well. So this is a fun one. How have you resourced MC leaders to manage the very political and personal responses to COVID in a mission?
That one, Ben.
That's just for you. Yeah.
There's been a lot of conversation around the political side of things, and whether that's with our MCs, with our staff, their neighbors. And I've just continually pushed people, and I know, this may go against the grain with most people, but I'm not a real political guy, and I often will just talk to them about what's going on personally with you in terms of, what the political landscape and what's that done to the church and those sorts of things. The church can adjust and shift and shape and do different things. And so what do you need personally as a result of maybe the political landscape? Because there's fears, there's anxieties, there's stresses, there's so many different things. And so I think we've really tried to dig into the personal, the heart of our people and our neighbors, rather than have all this outside conversation that really doesn't get after the heart. And so that's really been our goal with our MCs, even meeting with our MC leaders just a few days ago, just talking to them just about, hey, how are people's hearts? How are people's personal lives? A lot of things that Jared just mentioned too, with the kids, and just resourcing people to take care of themselves and their family members.
Yeah, and I'll also point you to a whole series we did on the gospel and politics in our webinars this summer, specifically to address that in more time than I gave Duff. Rather, I think 4.5 hours or so of it. So that's been a big thing and will continue to be a big thing, not just in election season, but going forward. So Jared, there's a question for you about how MCs look a little bit different than they did in the past.
Yeah. And I'll again try to be super fast on this. If anybody has any follow-up questions, just email me, jared@crossingparagould.com. I'll be happy to try to help you navigate further. But we no longer have MC leaders. We have MC host. And so the idea is that if you are a host of an MC, that your job is to pray for specific people that you want to pull into a group, and then to gather those people for a weekly meeting, make sure they're gathering into DNAs, and then just even outside of that weekly meeting. And then they basically delegate all the responsibilities. So if you're not a host of an MC, you're a co-host. We've also made all of the MCs much smaller. I mentioned this earlier. Before we relaunched, we had, I know like in my MC, we had 45 people. That was men, women, and children. But now you have to multiply by no more than 12 adults. And then I would just say, finally, MCs are no longer a catch-all for us. And this is huge. I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. We used to always say that was the front door into our church. And it was kind of a come one, come all, even if you didn't even understand what missional communities were all about. And that was kind of beautiful. But the problem is people would come and they would flood it, and they didn't even know what they were signing up for. So they would show up for basically like a friend in the name of Jesus, or like a small group or whatever else. And that would really compromise the culture. And so now moving forward, we're just saying as a church, we're going to focus on one of two groups of people, either those who are far from God or those who want to be resilient disciples. And if you want to be a resilient disciple, which I could define for you if you email me, we would just say a missional community is for you. And so we actually just launched a 7-week video series that every single member of a missional community has to watch before they can even jump into a missional community, that describes what a resilient disciple is and how missional communities, we believe, are going to help in the process of forming you into that man or woman that Jesus made you to be. So that's at least, I guess, 3 or 4 changes that we've made.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jared. And again, I know we could go into all of those in a long form format, and maybe we should at some point. I think it would serve a lot of folks. So John's question was how deep or shallow do you keep discussion content in a missional community? I assume you're talking here about kind of missional community meeting of whatever size, if we can throw that in there. And I assume you're talking about like spiritual discussion, talking about scriptures or that kind of stuff. And I'll answer this real fast. Is what we've seen is we haven't asked folks to change. In fact, we've encouraged folks not to change discussion based on non-believers being in the room. And if anything, we just said, hey, be really intentional about defining terms. And, hey, we're gonna open the scriptures now. And we try to keep all the conversations centered on the scriptures rather than what the pastor said or that kind of stuff, so that everyone can participate. Now, very often what the pastor said or however that functions gets brought in at times. But if anybody's open the scriptures and kind of going, hey, what do you see as a starting point? What jumps out at you? What do you see about God? What do you see about people? Conversations like that, anyone can participate, even if they don't actually even believe what the scripture are teaching, because you're just saying, what do you see right now out of it? So we just ask folks to clarify terms and try to explain why we do things. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pray. Why? Because we believe that God is the giver of all good gifts. And so we're going to pray before our meal, and just take a little bit of time to clarify things. Anybody else add 10 seconds on that I missed by trying to go too fast?
I just like what you're saying about engaging. We have 2 non-believers in our MC, and we don't, compromise what we're going to talk about. But I like what you're saying, Ben, like engaging them, asking them questions, and just like, hey, where are you at with this? Like, how does this, hit you? And I've found that that's great at like drawing them out and hearing where they're at. And so we can love them and pray for them well.
Yeah. To try to minimize the conversation or talk less about the Bible or kind of go Jesus light, I think actually disserves them. One of the things that we and we've learned from others throughout history is that the community, seeing how Christians operate different than the rest of the world, can be a great apologetic and testimony of the way that the gospel shapes us and makes us different. Real scenario, a non-believer seeing a couple of folks in our community fight and then reconcile and then be friends again just made a light bulb go off. And they're like, because that doesn't happen. If you're mad at someone, you ghost them or you attack them and you don't remain friends with them, or you passive aggressively, move on. And yeah, we're great, but not really. And seeing the difference within that community can be really helpful. We're right at time. Anything that any of you feel that the Spirit's leading you to say before we wrap up? Jared, you're looking thoughtful, so I want to make sure that I don't move on before you do.
Oh yeah, no, man. I was just trying to listen, but no,
Okay.
I don't have anything.
Okay. Cool. Then yeah, thank you all for joining us. There's more. Every one of these webinars ends with there being way more that we could talk about. There's a question that came up about leadership development that we didn't get to, but again, we did a webinar on that already, and I hate that we're pointing you back toward other things, but this series has been intended to build on itself and to interweave with itself. And so Sunny put the link and the URL to previous webinars up there. And then all of this, especially around missional communities, Saturate and Soma have been trying to lead out and learn in different contexts and different seasons around the concept of discipleship in missional communities and living out our gospel identities in these things called missional communities for a lot of years in the past. We'll continue to learn and pivot, to use a 2020 word, and adjust and be creative as God shapes us going forward. But there's a ton of resources from what we have experienced at saturatetheworld.com. And we have a membership where just hundreds of audio and video and print resources, including some that Sunny shared today, and we'll send out in the follow-up email tomorrow or later this week, are available. So thank you for joining us. Allison, Jared, Duff, thank you for your insights, and thank you for being learners alongside us. And everybody else, thank you for being learners, and we look forward to continuing this journey with you. Last thing I'll say is this is our last Church of the Future webinar, but we are going to do a year-end wrapping up 2020 webinar on December 8th. My friend Jeff Vanderstelt is going to join us, and we're just going to center it on the theme of gospel hope to end a hard year. So no series around it, just an honest look back at specific and general things that we've all experienced this year, and inviting Jeff and having a conversation with you and participants and others about what does it look like to remember the truths of the gospel that were true at Christmas 2,000 plus years ago, that'll be true every Christmas and every day in the midst of this year and beyond. So December 8th, same time, we'll see you then. Have a great day.